Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar by Ishraq. Over to you.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you guys actually for having me. I'm really excited to be discussing this topic with you guys and with everyone in the community. All right, so just a quick about me. So I've been doing Sitecore for more than 9 years now, and like anything that's related to technology is something that is fascinating. Whether it's like 100% in alignment with what we're doing with Sitecore or something that's going to impact us at a certain point. So if you guys are wondering, why am I talking about the, like the moral question of algorithms, and why I've selected this topic actually to discuss this year. And actually I've been, beside like my personal interest in ethics and technology in general, last year I had the chance to attend during the symposium a talk by Jason Sincere from Sitecore, and his topic was about who watches the watchers. And for me, it's like, all right, so everyone, like when we talk about Sitecore, is like either interested in the technical aspect of it, of the marketing aspect, or the business, and we touch a little bit about other things that impact the way we look and implement technology. When GDPR, for example, like has been approved and introduced in the EU, almost like most of us has spent lots of client hours and budgets, right, implementing and re-implementing like our websites to be GDPR compliant. And second, to rethink the way we think about the customer experience in a way that gonna maintain, like their privacy, and at the same time gives them the choice to have an explicit consent in the way they are sharing their data, and how like these brands and websites are storing and dealing with their data. So lots and lots and lots of questions that has been risen about personal data and like privacy, and the way that like brands handling these data almost everywhere in the industry. The revelation of the scandal of Facebook, for example, last year, it added lots and lots of pressure on the brands and the way that they define trust and their relationship with their clients, right? So it's no longer about having this cool technology that helps you to predict or give your customers, recommendations, or, about personalizing their experience, but it's more now about their part of the equation. Are they willing to share their information or not? Is it secure enough? Is it happening in a way that for these brands is not going to have any legal consequences? So we're expanding our area of thinking beyond the technicalities of the technology into other disciplines that are affecting us in a way or another. If we take Sitecore Cortex, for example, like in its introduction, it's like very, very nice addition to Sitecore and Sitecore 9.1, right? And we have been discussing about this for the past couple of releases in Sitecore, and how we are going to leverage machine learning. And machine learning is all about algorithms and data and how we are going to process that. So maybe it's not going to happen today, maybe it's not going to happen in 5 years, but eventually when, like the industry as a whole, when community is going to keep up with the technology in that sense, when they have a better understanding of, let's say, AI, machine learning, and eventually when rules and regulations are going to be set, we're going to be affected by this in a way or another. So I wanted just to start having such conversation around these topics, just because everyone else is talking about it, and because it's really important. Maybe it's not affecting us now, but that's what we thought about the regulations that happened about GDPR. Maybe we were residing outside the EU will not be affected, but eventually we are being affected, and many other countries are following the EU in those steps. So this is something eventually we have to do to deal with it. So why not start the conversation early so we don't end up going through, like decisions and retrospective around how we are implementing things, and try to think about this ahead. So I would love to start and kick off this conversation with a story, and this is one of the most discussed, let's say, philosophical question around ethics in history, and this is what's called the trolley problem. So in the trolley problem, let's assume that this scenario, that you and your friend are strolling in your car. It's speeding, going down the road, 60 miles per hour. And at the end of the road, there's like around maybe 5 workers or pedestrians crossing the road. And you try to hit your brakes, try, and it's not working. And like by the time I'm going to reach these guys, I'm definitely going to kill 5 of them. So the question is what you are going to do. So now you are in a situation where you don't have a full control on your vehicle, but somehow you still have, for the sake of argument, the ability to steer your vehicle. So you have a look at your left, and there's this alternative road, right? The twist in here that at the end of that road, now we have one person or one worker is like trying to cross the road. So what's gonna happen? So instantly in that position, now you've been presented with 2 options. Again, this is a hypothetical situation, and it's what we call a thought exercise. So it's not about solving the issue, but it's more about provoking you to think about these situations where you have to make a decision. So the decision in this case, am I going to kill one person, or I'm going to kill 5? So when this scenario is always being presented, almost like 90% of people would say, well, I'm gonna go and take the risk of killing 1 and save the 5. From the point of view of the greater good, people are more willing to sacrifice 1 in order to save 5. And this is most of the time what most people are going to think in scenarios where they have to make a tough decision. And it's not about being right or wrong, but it's about minimizing risks or damage in the situation. So let's take this a step further and assume now we are not in this car. So it's your friends in the car now, and you are the onlooker. So you're standing on top of a bridge. You're seeing your friend's car strolling down the road, and you know they don't have, like, that car doesn't have any brakes to stop, and eventually he's gonna kill like these 5 people. So what you are going to do? So now being in a situation where you're not involved in a direct responsibility of what's gonna happen, right? But you take a look at your right, and this is this fat guy standing next to you, and all he needs is like a small shove. They kind of fall from the bridge, stop the car, save the 5 people, and then in the sacrifice of killing 1 person. So when we stretch this scenario to a situation where you are, in this case, no longer bound to like a mechanical error in your car, but more of being an intentional actor in this situation, right? Because you're the one who's pushing that person in order to save these 5 people. And the most of the responsive is like, nah, I'm not gonna kill that guy in order to kill the 5, to save the 5. It's not his fault that he's large enough to help stop the car from, like from killing these people. So again, what kind of a principle? And when you retrospectively, thinking about that in the first situation, and it's the same principle, to sacrifice 1 in order to save 5, and in the second scenario, you're gonna say at the same thing. You're gonna kill someone in order to save the 5. But people opted in the first situation to do that. In the second situation, they said, nah, we can't do that. So this is just a small indication of how complex human beings are. So let's fast forward now to the 21st century, and we're talking about self-driving cars or autonomous cars. And in this situation, these cars, like are being run by the machine, by AI algorithms and this kind of stuff. So in the trolley problem scenario, what does AI fit? Is it the car in this scenario? So can we say AI is the car itself? Can we say the AI is the person who is driving the car? Or can say the AI in this case is the manufacturer of these cars? Is it the government that's going to put the rules and regulations of how we are going to govern self-driving cars? So there's lots and lots of questions, just like having to put this kind of technology within that philosophical um, domain, and thinking about intention and action, and where does AI fit in this situation. And just again, looking back at the trolley problem, we used to have, and again, until we have the self-driving cars, the dominant one, humans or human drivers are making these choices instinctively, right? So you are in the spur of the moment. You have been put in that situation where you have to choose between killing one or five, and humans are capable of making that choice and seeing the distinction. And laws and regulations over like centuries has been written having a human factor into consideration, and hence like the definition of a killing, this situation is different because the intention is not there. So you're not intending to kill someone. It's you've been in a situation to be the to kill someone in this case. But how about algorithms? Given that algorithms will be able to make these choices in advance when programmers are programming these algorithms, and the chances vary, right? So there might be a 60% chance that this car gonna hit one person, might be 45% chance to hit two, and maybe even 25% to hit zero, right? So well, and this scenario, who's gonna will be making this decision? And this is the example on the slide now, is a model that has been presented for programmers when they program algorithms for self-driving cars. So they might be hitting an animal, they might be hitting a man, they might be hitting a pregnant woman, right? Might be a case of an older person in comparison to a child, could be a, like a poor person, could be a rich one. So will car companies and governments choose which one to save in this case, given that these decisions are being made in advance during when we are like programming these algorithms? Are they going to choose to kill the many or the few? And again, so the questions that we are asking now, even from an ethic, so it's not even an ethical debate kind of a question, because we're not talking about what's the impact of, do we need more cars? How about the access to transportation, the effect of cars on the environment? So we're not even discussing ethical debates, but we're talking about scenarios that in a way or another will be in sooner or later. And if we take from that perspective, machine learning, decision making, like how the algorithm work in that sense, as an example. So as you may, like many of you guys already know that when we are training the machine to learn how to act in such situation, or whatever like your intention of creating this machine learning system. So you have a preset data sets of specific nature that you're interested to work with. This have been optimized in order to, like be removed and be cleared in a way that fits within your intention of creating this algorithm. You have a trained model, then you have an optimized model, and you always have an inference engine that's play around. So what does AI sits in this? And we know like this is like a complex, this is a whole process that is not like we don't have a bit that flips this to be a black and white decision board. So it's not like and the trolley problem, it's all about like steering the car right or left. So it's not only something that we can consider this is right or wrong, or this is good or this is evil. The issues that we are discussing now, it's not about an obvious right answer, but it's rather choose between to undesirable actions. And this is what we call ethical dilemmas. So when we talk mainly about the ethics of the algorithms, it's these hypothetical scenarios or these dilemmas that there's no clear answer to it. There's nothing that's called right or wrong. It's you're always being pushed to choose between two choices that you don't want to even make that decision. That's what makes the distinction between a human decision and algorithm. That's why it's even an additional reason why we have to think about these things when we do our implementation, because that's not a straightforward decision and nowadays, because the kind of system we are developing is not only autonomous car. There's lots and lots of different and real life scenarios now where AI has been the dominant and sometimes the sole decision maker. I'm going to discuss this shortly. So, ethics of the algorithm. So, the first thing when you want to talk about ethics, morality, principles, there's always a set of terms and definitions that we need all to be on the same page in order to say, yeah, this is considered an immoral action, or this is an ethical, this is should fall under a law, or this is just an inherent bias in it. So the main, let's say, terminology that are associated with these are ethics, morality, bias, and law. So ethics are moral principles that governs the person's behavior and action, while morality is the principles that put the distinction between this is right, this is wrong, this is a good behavior, this is a bad behavior, and almost like joined with these terminology again, we're talking about humans are bias. So bias is a prejudice, whether it's in favor or against a thing, a person, or a group of people, and it's almost most of the time considered unfair. And finally, the laws that gonna vary between communities and countries and cultures that are put in a place in order to enforce, the course of action of things and sometimes to pose penalties for those who are not inherent with them. So again, just looking at these terminologies and the definitions of those, these are human artifacts. So by default, these are hard to implement and instrument. So these varies by culture, by community. And these rules are different from country and country, and they're continuously changing. So what has been considered a right behavior maybe 100 years ago, and in some certain cases like 20 years ago, is now considered unacceptable. So human changes, culture changes. So how, again, can we still fit technology within anything that's human related? So again, ethics and laws are a reflection of the society, right? And our societal values. So there's this study that has been conducted in order to put the autonomous car in the midst of a philosophical debate. And they took two schools of thinking, one by Bentham and one by Kant. And they asked people to evaluate the scenario of autonomous car within these two schools of thinking, just to see if we are talking now about technology within a hypothetical philosophical, like debate. It's something, again, it's for provoking thinking. How would people think now in comparison to like centuries ago? So if we're talking about Bentham school of thinking, the car should follow a utilitarian ethics in which a car should take an action that will minimize total harm, even if it killed the bystander or the passenger. And this means for those who have chosen to steer the car to the left and kill one in order to save the five, you're following a utilitarian kind of thinking. While Kant comes and say, no, we should follow more of a duty-bound principle. So, in a nutshell, a car should not kill. And he says, like, do not take an action that's gonna explicitly harm, like human beings, and let the car take its own course of action, even if the end result is going to be killing more people. So in the first scenario, we just let the car keep slowing down the street and killing the five. you should not be an active decision maker in this situation, and make the car take its course of action. So again, when people has been presented with the case of autonomous car and what the car should do in that situation, because the car is the decision maker, and many people have sided with Bentham because their intention is, when they want to own these cars, is to minimize total harm, right? Nobody would like to be in a car that, if it's involved in the scenario, like, am I gonna hit an animal, am I gonna hit a person? And some occasions, like, the car might decide to hit an object and hurt the driver themselves, right? So that study found that most people sided with Bentham. However, when they have been presented with the question, are you going to buy such car? And the majority of people said no, because they want to buy a car that's going to protect them at all costs, and in a way it's like, as Kant, it doesn't matter if they killed as many people as long as you're gonna maintain your life. But at the same time, they want everyone else to buy cars that gonna minimize harm. So just thinking about this adds to the complexity of human thinking and the value system that we're working with. And again, the question of technology, how does it fit within this, value system? So many would ask, why now? So why we're talking about ethics and technology in the 21st century? And actually, this has nothing of this has been new, right? So when we talk about technology, it's not necessarily we're talking about computers and stuff. So since the 18th century, there has been, the discussion of coal mines and children working in coal mines. So the technology was there, if we can say that's a technology, and I think it's fair to say it's a technology to do coal mining. But at the 18th century, for children to work in coal mines, that has been an acceptable behavior. Fast forward to the 19th century and all the advances in medicine, right? So we have cloning, for example. We had the uh, pregnancy control pills, right, introduced during that times. So the technology is there, but and it's possible, but is it ethical? So always technology advances quickly than societies, right? And this adds pressure on our judgment and value. Again, nothing of this is new, and the challenge would be how we can now, like AI is being discussed within and put in this conversation. So one of the main challenges, again, nothing of this is new. So put this aside, put like the course of how technology has advanced over the past 100 years, for example. We almost have more than 100 years worth of science fiction, right? If you just take a look at all these movies that has been produced about the invasion of robots and how the world's gonna look like if algorithms or robots are smart enough to take, like to rule the world. So again, the challenge would be is we have already been discussing this um, for a while now. And this is only going to push these discussions around an ethical dilemma to the start, to the scene. So it's just pushing this to be the number one discussion that's happening now. Just because we couldn't solve it in the past doesn't mean we can't solve it now, but it's actually just to keep asking these questions around ethics. I'm going to play this clip and talk about the impact of AI for a bit. So in this video, in a nutshell, so Amazon Echo has picked a conversation between a couple, identifying that when they use some keywords in their conversation, it's a trigger to send an email to someone in their contacts, and it could be the conversation that they had and send it over to their friend or to their contact. So just looking at this from another angle, which is like how AI or how technology has been introduced in our lives in a very large scale, right? And we are in a position to measure the impact. So the impact of technology is pretty much clear. So we need to think about the trade-offs. We need to think about the risks that are introduced in our lives by 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 the algorithms. Again, if we keep asking the same question, why should we care? So algorithms are increasingly being used to make decisions for us, about us, and sometimes with us. They are progressively capable of making decisions on their own, and in some scenarios, like it might be either used as the main or as an auxiliary tools in making decisions, and in certain scenarios are the only decision makers in areas and ways in life that we never expected gonna happen maybe a decade ago, but now this is our reality. So many people outside the tech domain, they think when people with technology are developing these algorithms, they're not taking this ethics or principles into this and values into consideration, and we do that, which is not the case. And there's lots and lots of examples of when big companies such as an IBM are taking that into consideration. But again, we should care because even if we are not the producer of these algorithms, we are being affected by it. And even if we're not part of developing a program that's going to determine if I should be getting a loan from the bank, uh, my family member is going to be uh, someone who's interacting with it, right? Um, so to which extent do we trust that there's no bias is going to happen just because of all the history of the society and its impact on the data that are generating these systems. So when we talk about the ethics of algorithms, there is no simple answer. There is no right answer even. So we're talking about keep asking a series of questions and putting a series of scenarios and hypotheticals in order to just start to have an understanding of to which extent we are interacting. Again, it's not the trolley problem. So the trolley problem is just a straightforward scenario where we have a switch right, left, and that's it, simple and straightforward scenario. But it's like for centuries we're unable to come up with an answer that is universally accepted for such a scenario. So now with the technology of creating more and more of more complex scenarios. So what are the trade-offs when we talk about this? Who should be part of the conversation of ethics and algorithms? What are the conversations happening for these sophisticated scenarios? And how do we know that while we are building the system, we are actually going to be one of these dilemmas? And how do we know that you have an ethical dilemma? So these are continuous questions that we need to keep asking. So an autonomous car, so no individual human being that is making these decisions. We have manufacturers might be creating cars that their main goal, again, they want to increase the safety of their passengers, right? So the algorithm over time is going to learn that if, in order to maximize the safety of the passenger, this means the algorithm might need to increase the risk slightly for pedestrians in order to make sure that it's learning how to maximize the safety for its passengers. So again, it's a complicated scenarios, and it's not only those are part of this conversations. We're talking about the impact and the market economics. We're talking about rules and regulations that eventually going to be put in place in order to regulate AI, and the conversation is already happening. And again, we're back to keep in mind we're talking about ethics, so we're talking about what's considered right and wrong, what's considered a fair or unfair conversation. And these again are human conversation. This is You can't go and ask a deep learning algorithm, for example, why did it make this decision this way and not that way? This is not something um, an algorithm or a machine can answer. These are human conversations. So, how do we think and define ethics around AI? And I think one of the main steps in order to start the conversation is to go a step back and actually define what an AI is. So if you're asking someone, can you define artificial intelligence to me? And for in most case scenarios, you will end up not having a single definition, but it's more of a compilation of things. So it could be sensing and sensors, reasoning and strategy. It's algorithms, right? It's about training and teaching methodologies. It's about data that are used to train the model. It's about this comprehensive framework that eventually defines AI. So when you look about this case, do you look at this as a whole, or would you break this into individual components in order to think about ethics? So an autonomous car, is it this car as the end product, or if we're going to break this down into we have an algorithm that's running this, we have sensors that going to sense the objects on the road and then make the decision, or sense like the signals back to algorithm to make a decision. Is it the data that has been used during that training? Is it the developers who programmed this algorithm and put all of their, bias and let's say, I'm not gonna even say bias, let's say the prejudgment into the development of these algorithms. So if we are to start with the obvious location, which is algorithm. So again, how is ethics and this is different from bias? What are the words that we are modeling in this case? Is it an autonomous car? Is it an HR system that's gonna rule the hiring? Is it a criminal system that's going to determine if this offender is gonna do it again or not? So we're talking about multiple disciplines, and who decide how this gonna look like? Is it the manufacturer of the cars? Is it the programmer who's developing that algorithm? Is it fair or unfair? How are these decisions are being made and on whose behalf? And if you think at a certain point of this process that there might be a bias, so do we intervene in that, and how and when we are going to do that? So again, just taking a deeper look back into the machine learning algorithm, for example. And for many people, it's just a black box. And the black box is posed with a question, outputs an answer that is high probability of being correct. So in the practice, what you are going to do is to create a many number of black boxes and choose one with the highest accuracy. So in order to build this, you keep feeding this black box a series of questions, and you know that the right answer is going to be C. So keep feeding it, feeding it, feeding it, and the hope that it's gonna eventually find the correct answer, and then this is how prediction is happening. So how we are going to define or explain this to people outside like the technological domain, people who eventually gonna be putting these rules and regulations who are going to be applied on AI, or those who are going to judge that this is a biased decision or not. So just taking a step into these individual components, you can even look at the trade-offs in a more and more closer sense, which gonna raise a more series of questions. Let's take data, for example. One of the main tools that has been used in reliance on artificial intelligence is some criminal or policing tools that use in criminality, like let's say, for example, in Australia. So what they actually did was to take more than 100 years of data that they have collected, over time about criminals and the police system, and they fed that into the algorithm. And their hope was to determine a pattern of how these criminals, how to identify these criminals, or eventually, you know, offender did it once, what are the circumstances that they're gonna be a repeat offenders or not? So the first question gonna happen like 100 years ago. There has been lots and lots of actions or people who has been identified as criminals, which is not the cases now. So maybe it's an indigenous people who has been in Australia and 100 years ago, they has been considered as a criminal, but now this is completely irrelevant. So what are we going to do with the data that is characterizing those people in that point of time? Are we going to remove data and consider these are invalid? How about domestic violence that has been identified maybe in the past 30 or 40 years as something that is wrong? Because prior to that, that used to be not even a single record about domestic violence added as kind of an criminal behavior. So are we going to insert data back into our data sets to like to teach the algorithm that now this is considered a criminal behavior? So the questions around data becomes more and more complicated, because how about the integrity of this data? And if we allow this to happen, like removing or inserting data, and this scenario of criminology, can this be applied on every single other scenario where we are developing these algorithms to make these decisions? Again, it's similar to our personal data that has been collected. So even if these data sets are only consistent of metadata or structure of how data has been collected, again, the questions are a bit different in this scenario, because the question will go back how this data has been collected, by whom, and why. So why we have started collecting this data in the first place? Was it just for testing purposes? Have we started this, like just as a proof of concept that we can implement this, and we eventually ended up collecting lots and lots of data that its purpose has just been to test a model or to test an algorithm, but now has been used on a wider scale? Under what circumstances do we know when those people who has been collecting data, let's say about human resources, uh, which factors has been there, what circumstances? Was there any social contract when the data has been collected? So when, let's say, the database about these criminals has been collected, have their information has been obtained in a legal way? Have they been aware about that there has been data collected about them that's going to be used later on in these systems? What was the expectations about these data, and can that be changed? And was it fair? Again, so if the questions about algorithms has been about how it's been modeled and by whom, it's slightly bit different when it comes to data, because data are more sensitive. It's more bounded to those who are collecting this data, those who are structuring these data sets and the circumstances to where this has been collected. And is it good? So we've discussed algorithms, we've discussed data. Let's take sensors, for example. So now you guys are sitting in this room watching this presentation, and everyone is having their own Wi-Fi, right? And we're sitting in this room, and signals are being transmitted on our behalf from mobiles, and every time you're connected to a Wi-Fi, you've been identified. So with these Wi-Fi and RFID and etc., so there's information that has been collected about us. So anyone outside the room that you're sitting on can say, based on the signals that sensors can collect, that we have 10 people in the room, that we have 5 people in the room. This person might be standing, this person might be walking, this person might be just signaling their hands. So who's watching the watchers in this case, right? Is it okay for other people who's just because they're giving us the service of Wi-Fi, Is it allow for them to see this data that we don't know that it's even been collected? How about extracting this information about people? Who decides that this is an ethical thing, since there's no, like explicit consent that this data has been collected on my behalf? Because for most cases, many people would not even realize that just your Wi-Fi can transmit lots and lots of information about you, about your mobile, right? About the things that you are doing. And this again put questions more on corporation, about technology, and being put in a more of a moral dilemma. And those are questions again that has not been resolved centuries ago, and now being put in the front, and these companies are being scrutinized in that context. And this can raise questions about trust, motivation, and innovation, and again other questions about, does this mean every time I'm going to write a single line of code, am I going to be thinking, is this going to be ethical or not? If this is going to be right or wrong? So again, a question is raising another question and another question. So when we're talking about AI, there's always a sense of talking about bias, right? Because talking about data, we're talking about human beings, we're talking about ethics, we're talking about moralities, and these are human artifacts, and there's always a bias is coming with that. So when we started thinking about machine and relevance to bias, the first question was like, technology was supposed to be succeeded, right, in eliminating bias where human intelligence failed in doing so. So an algorithmic bias happens when an AI not act in an objective way, but according to prejudice that might exist with the people who has formulated and structured this data. Might be a bias pre-existing in the training data, and sometimes it might be emergent from the bias from the human interaction with them. So it could be, if we just take a look at the machine learning again as an example, so you have people have been, data that has been collected. So what about the bias for the people who have collected that? We have datasets that has been cleaned and trained, so there might be bias within the people who has defined these rules. And then there's a bias in how we are interacting with that as a human being. So AI is as good as the data it has trained on, because again, this data can include a pre-existing human bias that's stemming from individual or societal level, because the data that has been collected for the criminology system, those are society data. These rules and regulations or the value system has been defined by the system, not necessarily by individual. So what is happening when we're talking about data ethics, that we are bringing along all the biases that is inherent in the human nature within societies, and we're putting it out there to the machine to learn that this is okay to have these things, and eventually, instead of building these systems that's supposed to eliminate bias, it's actually enforcing it. And there's lots and lots of examples for that. A clear example is like lots and lots of studies about the face recognition software in cameras or such can distinguish for people from different race. If this is just a straight ahead, like in this scenario, a person who's smiling or winking. So does someone blink? Does someone wink? Another example has been, and that was very, very astonishing video I've watched on YouTube, and I was like, it can't be happening. So it's a soap dispenser, and there's this guy in the bathroom, and he's a person of color. He's black. So every time he would put his hand under the soap dispenser, it's not gonna work. So I tried 1, 2, 3 times, and it's not working. So what he did, he just took a tissue paper, and that was a white tissue paper, put it under the soap dispenser, and suddenly worked. So that's like just an example that screams bias and discrimination. So how these manufacturers did not even take into consideration when they built and tested this system that it's not only white people are going to use their products, but there's a whole lot of a spectrum of people that are going to use that. And your product shouldn't be discriminating. Another example in the courtroom. So there's this system that's used in the US that's called Combis. And this is a tool that's used to help judges to evaluate the risk of criminals if they're going to be turned into a repeat offenders or not. So there has been an assessment for this algorithm or this system. And they discovered that when the algorithm was right, the decision making that happened was fair. However, when the algorithm was wrong, more people of color were almost twice as likely labeled to as a higher risk of being a repeater offended than white people. So even in situations where we do think that a system like this that should be unbiased and been made more of, because it's used in the court system, it's something gonna judge people on it. There's an inherent bias in it based on whatever the sentences has been used before, when people of color has been more likely to be charged by law to making a crime, even if it turned out that they even didn't do that wrong. HR systems. So this is another study that showed that more than in the employment in the high-tech workforce, the employment is almost 70% for white people, 14% for Asian, 8% for African Americans, and 8% for Hispanics. So when we take this data and feed it to the human resource system, and we next gonna tell the machine to decide whom to hire and who's not. So again, we're telling simply by just the look of this data set, we're telling the system to go ahead, hire more white people than everyone else. So these are just a number of examples of how data sets and how data is inspiring, like machine learning and algorithms in a way or another, and how that is actually can come with a very inherited bias in it. So the next question would be, how do we combat social bias? And the assumption would be, does correct data means we have a correct model? But again, we are living in an imperfect world, so how can we define what is a correct data? So there's multiple ways of doing things. One of them would be to take a look at the algorithm themselves and make sure that by the way it has been developed and implemented, it won't perpetuate bias. And this is like pretty much crucial for systems that are relying on predictions which are out of step with reality. The probational system, for example, because we know for sure that the data that has been collected and the data sets gonna have a biased data sets. So make sure when we know how these algorithms around what is going to be modeled, in this case around criminal data, we already know that there's going to be bias. So how we can make sure that these algorithms won't have that by design. Another example would be, can we consider other ways that can test and ensure that these AI systems and algorithms are not going to be biased? An example would be a tool developed by IBM that's called a bias detection algorithm that can be used to test and ensure that these AI or system based on AIs are fit within a preset defined set of principles and standards that ensure its integrity. And one of the most important factor in this is like how to build a culture of accountability and reporting. So for those who can spot bias, whether during the dataset creation and collection or even structure, during training, during the human interaction with it, if someone can spot that, would they be, what's the likelihood for them to interfere and raise questions and hold people accountable that this is going to result with a bias? What should we do about it? And as a final thought on this, obviously, we need to make sure that our house is in order. So we can't expect an AI algorithm that has been trained on data that comes from society to simply be better than society, right? Unless we explicitly designed it to be, unless we take diversity as an example into consideration and the different spectrum of people who's going to eventually interfering with that to be part of that process. As a final thoughts on the discussion around AI ethics and the principles, again, we need to uncover and resolve ambiguity inherited within the terminology. Remember, when we started the discussion around the ethics of AI, we started by discussing the terminology and the definition, because sometimes, and it's not easy to have a consensus, right, on what does these terminology mean from different cultures and different backgrounds. So this will require to identify how we are going to use this terminology in different disciplines and sectors. So we're no longer discussing this in a philosophical domain or in law domain. We're now talking about these within technology. So we need to reach at least to a consensus around how we are going to define this within the technological domain. And if we can't reach to that consensus, at least we have to develop some sort of terminology to prevent different groups from talking past one another. And if the majority is going to agree that this is how we define bias and this is how bias is meant to be in AI, then we need to make sure that everyone is going to listen, and it's not going to be done based on what's right for me as a manufacturer and what's right for me as a government, right? Um, uh, an example, and again, GDPR is not necessarily related to this, but this is an example of how this can be happening. So when, since the provisioning of GDPR, the main intention was to strengthen to some extent the information rights of individual users, right? And we ended up with a more stricter documentation of obligations and awareness of what do we mean by data subjects right among the responsibility during the data processing. Again, ethics are human artifacts and they can change and adapt, and it's not easy to regulate that, right? Again, same question. We can't go ahead and ask a deep learning system why did it make a decision in that way. However, we can enforce explainability and documentation for these algorithms, like the black box concept, for people to understand what is the intention of the creation of that model, how it has been modeled, how the data sets has been collected in order to help making an informed decision, and like to reach to a common understanding when we talk about that. Another aspect would be to identify and resolve the tension between how technology eventually gonna put pressure on our values and societal understanding. And there's different ways of looking at that one, and there's lots and lots of trade-offs that we need to take. So an example would be, do we use algorithms to make decisions and predictions more accurate, or we need to ensure that this is happening in fairness and equal treatment? Are we going to use data to improve the quality and efficiency of the services we are providing versus respecting the privacy and the information autonomy of individuals? And an example would be like when we use automation to make lives easier. So are we going to have the focus there, or a trade-off against promoting self-actualization and dignity? So there is lots and lots of trade-offs when we going to discuss the principles around AI. And at a certain point, we have to make a decision, but at least when we are going to make a decision, I want to make the customer personalized experience is done in a proper way for them. Just take into consideration their right for privacy. And finally, building a more rigorous evidence base for discussion on ethical and societal issues. So when we discuss about the criminology system, or let's say any system that going to make a judgment or a decision for different groups, particularly that those who might be disadvantaged or underrepresented, how we make sure that diversity and this huge spectrum of people is within this conversation, and they have a voice, and they have a role to be part of this, so we don't end up having like a soap dispenser that only work for white people. And that's it for me. I'll be discussing this during the symposium with a panel, including Amanda and Sitecore, talking about trust and what's the impact of, like 2019 has been characterized as the year that companies will spend on rebuilding customer trust, after all the revelation that we've seen last year. So, and trust again has to do with the humans, so how we can value humans within the technological sphere. So these are the questions that we need to keep asking, because if our main goal is to provide a proper customer experience, we want to create a trust with our customers, and if we want to allow for these technological advances to keep continuing, because for us coming from a technical background, we know that we are capable of taking this technology beyond of what we are doing now. But again, what is the impact on society? And when these discussions are happening within society, laws and regulations gonna happen. It's gonna eventually regulate and govern the technology. So if we start these discussions the soonest, this is where we make sure that what we are envisioning about the future of technology, something achievable and something that is in line with our human values and principles. And that's it for me. Thank you guys for listening for me for almost an hour. Wow.
Thank you so much, Ishraq. That was a very relevant topic, especially in today's day and age. So, thank you again for taking us through this, and well, good luck with the symposium.
Thank you so much. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to present this for you guys.
Thank you. All right, thanks everyone who attended. We'll be sharing the recording shortly. So, thank you again.
Thank you, and have a lovely day.
Goodbye.